I think the production team needs to figure out if my mic is working. There it is. You can all hear me. Welcome back to the transition stage here at the Sustainable Innovation Forum. I am Maitri Sitaraman. I'm your chair for these transition conversations. This morning we heard from industry leaders about our energy transition. This afternoon we're going to do a deep dive into our mobility and transport transition needs. Just to highlight exactly how important this conversation is going to be, this morning we heard from the UN-backed Race to Resilience campaign, which has launched its metrics framework, which is going to allow non-state actors to really tell us and measure the human impact of their actions for the first time. That includes businesses, it includes cities and regions. Now, the worrying bit of this was the McKinsey report that was announced as a partnership with this Race to Resilience. And under that, the scenario that they're painting is absolutely dire. They've talked about, let's see, I'm going to list this out for you, almost half the world's population exposed to a climate hazard related to heat stress, drought, floods, or water stress in the next decade. That's up from 43%, and that's under a 1.5 degree scenario. Under a 2 degree scenario, another additional 800 million people could be living in urban areas under severe water stress compared with today. I mean, the list goes on and on. I'll stop there, but the picture that's been painted for us again this morning on a Monday has been of absolute urgency in addressing all our issues when it comes to these transitions. So transport being a big issue here. Let's kick off with that. Remember, please keep participating in these conversations. Send us your questions through the platform. Use social media. The team is gathering all your questions and then passing them on to me. I will then ask those questions to every single one of our experts, one of whom joins us right now. Welcome to Warwick Goodall. He is transport and mobility expert from PA Consulting. No one knows better than you, Warwick, how difficult it is to have these conversations. Tell us, how exactly do we make these transitions go faster? You've been speaking to the UK government, working with them closely. Use that as an example and tell us where are the pitfalls and where are the successes.
Well, first of all, Maitri, I'm delighted to join you virtually into Cessnock Keys, and as you say today, the pressure is really on for the whole industry to change and adapt. You talked about transport there and why transport is so important in the transition. You know, transport is one of the largest sectors of carbon emissions, and in fact, in the UK, the single largest sector for carbon emissions. And therefore really one of those critical areas for that transition. And I think you were asking there about the who's involved, who needs to make this happen, and the answer is that we all have a responsibility to act in this transition in transport and across the mobility sector as well. And really I think there's three groups of actors here. We've got government, and we're hearing a lot, of course, at COP26 about the commitments, the ambitions, the targets that governments and states are making. Then there's business and the role of business in bringing the innovation, the funding and accelerating that transition. And then actually something that we don't spend enough time talking about is actually the responsibility for all of us as drivers, as passengers on public transport. What are the changes we're going to need to make to our behaviour as well, which are also going to need to be huge over the coming decades.
What are those changes, Warwick? Because like you said, we're not talking about it enough. There's a lot of protesting, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of concern, rightly so. What are the behavioral changes we need to make individually in this room, those who will join us from around the world online? What are the three things we can do right now to change things?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the most important things is that all of our citizens need to be able to be showing the leadership of the things that we can do, the actions that we can change ourselves. If you think about some of the other things, people are already thinking about their diet, thinking about changing what they eat, people thinking about going vegan 3 days a week, this kind of thing. You know, we need to think about what that means for us in our transport behaviour. How can we, what is the equivalent of veganism in transport, right? Could we cycle to work 3 days a week? That kind of thing. Also, for all of those suburban families with 2 cars, why haven't you already switched one of those cars to an electric vehicle? No problem at all, range anxiety to do the school run with an electric vehicle. Simple changes, behavioural changes that everyone can make in the coming years.
It's a little bit, it's easy to say switch to an electric vehicle, right? You get the electric vehicle, you can use it for your school run, and then, God forbid, you have to drive to Glasgow from London. You start having charging issues at some point. Infrastructure is not an individual's responsibility, and it becomes a business responsibility, it becomes a governmental responsibility. How much of a lead is possible to be taken by individuals here? And can you give me an example or two of clients you've worked with who've managed to actually succeed at it, and those who are still struggling?
Well, let's talk indeed about the infrastructure challenge here. This infrastructure challenge is across transport as a complete system. Transport, in fact, is a system of systems, and all of that infrastructure needs to change and adapt. And we need to invest in public transport infrastructure. That is more trains, more buses, encouraging people to not take their personal cars is still a key aspect of the transition we need to make. But then you also mentioned there the infrastructure that we need for that transition to electric vehicles. And I believe that is going to be an absolutely huge transition for the country, for our economy. If you think about major infrastructure transitions we've had in the last decades, just think about broadband. Think about how the government and business worked together for the last 20 years to transform the way that we're all connected to the internet, to bring the fibre and higher speeds of broadband into our houses and change the way and transition us towards the internet. In the same way, we need to be able to embrace a transition to much greater electric vehicle infrastructure. And it's not just for people who can park their car on the drive and plug it in, but we also need to provide that infrastructure to the 40% of people, of households in the country that actually don't have off-street parking. We need to be able to provide that infrastructure for people to be able to charge their vehicles. And that's going to be an enormous shift from where we are today to reach the government's ambitious target by 2035 of all new vehicles being electric vehicles or zero-emission vehicles.
What's the biggest hurdle in that work when it comes to actually placing these across a larger space of infrastructure outside of cities? So say, for example, on my street in London, they have now put electric charge points on every alternate lamppost. That's easy to do in a city environment. But what about the suburbs? What about the highways? Where are we at, say, for example, in the UK, since that's being touted so much, and also in some of the other countries that you've been able to advise?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that it's not the case that rural countries necessarily find it possible to do this. If you look at other countries in the continent that have made huge progress, like Norway, hugely sparse population as well, that they've been able to drive an enormous shift to electrification. They've got a target actually of 2025 for the end of selling petrochemical engines. So very ambitious, 10 years ahead, in fact, of the UK's target. So this sort of thing can be done. But you're absolutely right that the challenge here for rural communities is, if you look at broadband as well, a similar challenge. The government is still investing, announced only this year, another 5 billion to try to connect faster broadband for people in rural areas. And we've been working on that for 15 years in the UK. So we need to learn the lessons from other infrastructure rollout to make sure that we don't leave people behind, that this transition is going to be equitable, and that everyone can partake in it, not just in the cities.
I'm aware that you worked, and let's talk about being equitable. I'm well aware that you have worked with partners in Latin America, for example. What were the biggest challenges you found rolling this out in markets that are not as developed? And I keep coming back to this point because if it's not a just transition, it doesn't really work. What were your learnings from working in Latin America, and does that reflect on some of the challenges you expect to face here in the UK, for example?
Yeah, so the interesting thing in developing parts of the world, of course, is that if you can combine the demographic shift, where some 90% of the population in Latin America is expected to be in urban and suburban centres by 2050, and if you combine that with the climate goals we have by 2050, you can see how you can really focus in certain areas in order to deliver the transition there. Now, we worked actually to work with a private sector organisation bringing funding and financing to Latin America to electrify the fleets of buses, hugely important buses as public transport infrastructure in Latin America. And we've worked with them to help them bring funding, create joint ventures to be able to address the electrification of the bus fleet in Latin America. Currently, only about 2,000 buses have any electrical capability down there, only 1% of the whole bus fleet. So, huge opportunity to make that shift and electrify the fleet and make an enormous difference to the urban populations in Latin America.
Do you see that happening in terms of other ways the electrification transition's happening in more developed markets? I mean, you mentioned cycling to work, but we're talking also about electric scooters being used across the continent. Not to everyone's taste, yes, but they do the job. What other bits and bobs of innovation are going on? Because we tend to get a little bit stuck on the EV charging point. But there are other things that are happening that allow that mobility to happen, at least in urban areas. Can you talk us through what you're seeing in Europe, in the US, here in the UK?
Yeah, if you focus on business there and really the role of business for this transition, really we look to business to bring the innovation, the ingenuity, the great ideas that are going to make this transition happen in practice, the solutions. We look to business to bring the funding, as I was just referring as well. But we also need to look to business to bring the acceleration of this change. Now, you mentioned electric scooters. We've seen an explosion of electric scooters across Europe. And actually, I was fortunate to be part of helping set up the UK's first pilot for electric scooters in the West Midlands. So,
So you're
enormously
not a
great
popular man
opportunity
in the
there
West
to bring.
Midlands, are you? With the pedestrians, are you a popular man or not with the pedestrians in the West Midlands?
Well, you raise a great point, which is that all of these transitions will come with behavioural change as well, won't they? And we need to make sure that when we bring any new form of transport, we need to be able to understand it for not just the people who use it, but also the pedestrians and other people who live in our cities.
So run us through the top three bits of advice, is how I can put it, you give to your clients when they're getting into the process of discussing how we make this transition quickly. Because we don't have 15 years, Warwick. We really don't have that time. We cannot repeat the mistakes, as you said, of the broadband rollout. What are the top three things you start with to lay out the ground for your clients when you speak to them?
So I think the first point to really think about is what is the objective that we're trying to achieve. We need to be absolutely focused on which levers we are really trying to pull here. Sometimes people spend a long time pulling the smaller levers when we really need to go after the biggest changes. If you think about what I was saying there about electric vehicle infrastructure, we really need to think about that 40% of households that don't have the ability to charge off street, because those are the ones that will slow down the transition ultimately for electric vehicle transition. If you then think about how do we help business get on board, then focusing on research and development, innovation, ingenuity, and working in collaboration. Making sure that government can work together with the private sector and collaborate, whether that's on electric scooters, whether that's on new and innovative designs of electric vehicle chargers that we're seeing around the country right now. And then I think the third thing I would say is
Sorry, go ahead.
to really think about the people in this. We tend to think a lot about the solutions in terms of the technology, but really we need to think about the people. We need to think about the behavior. We need to think about the service design. How do we design services that are so much more attractive for people to use that they feel like they want to make the transition? For example, think about electric vehicle charging. We need to make that such an attractive concept. But we'll have all have read at the moment in the press about lots of examples of electric vehicle chargers broken or in dark corners of car parks, places that are not attractive to help people to make that transition. So we really need to think about design and use the power of design to really unlock the opportunity for people to see how the transition can fit within their life.
If I had to flip that around and the concept of bringing design into it, changing and modifying consumer behavior, how much attention is the government, say for example here in the UK, paying to that? There's a lot of talk about wanting the transition, setting targets for 2030. How much are they paying attention to what you are talking about, and how much attention are they paying to the difficulties that businesses are facing in rolling all this out?
Yeah, well, I think it's a work in progress, isn't it? And it's probably a patchwork of initiatives. But where great work is being done, for example, is where government is looking very carefully at things like accessibility. And I've worked with the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles to help them look at how users use charge point infrastructure and how accessible needs are being accommodated within those designs, and coming up with design principles that can be used by all of the charge point operators to really raise the bar, increase the standard to make sure that we support everyone in society. And also not just the people that are charging their cars, but also the pedestrians walking down those pavements as well, to make sure that, if we do have to put more infrastructure along the streets, it's not going to clutter up the streetscape or create problems for other users of that space.
Well, we only have about a minute or so left, Warwick. I just want to ask you, we've got a couple of days left here at COP. What is your hope for the transport industry and for mobility at the end of this week? And are you planning to be optimistic or slightly just preparing to be disappointed?
Well, look, I'm hugely optimistic. I'm hugely optimistic about this. In fact, whilst we're talking about transport and mobility this afternoon here in this forum, it's actually Wednesday the 10th, one of the last days of COP26, which is Transport Day. And I think that Transport Day on Wednesday is going to be a hugely exciting time. There's going to be more and more announcements. We're seeing announcements already this week. There'll be more announcements by Wednesday. I'm hugely excited by that. I think it's going to be really inspiring. And we need to, and the reason it has to be so inspiring is because we need to inspire the people. We need to inspire all of us, the drivers, the passengers. We need to inspire everyone to make that transition, to make the change, and to feel like this is something that we could all be part of.
Let's hope that that holds true at the end of the week, Warwick. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Right, so we're going to rethink mobility. Warwick set that stage for us up very nicely.